Easter has come and gone, but death and resurrection keep on playing out. We read this in the book of Acts, where we hear of the early church that discovers its life in looking outwards beyond itself. Like the early church, we are in strange times. We may not be fearing violence, but our lives are certainly dislocated. The patterns and securities that we take for granted have been thrown around. And in uncertain times like these, the church has a message of hope. But more than this, I want to make the case that our message or our witness is comic, as it lifts us into a more joyous understanding of our life and identity as Christians. I also want to help you remain connected to our wider global church family. Our lives rub off on one another in creative and life-giving ways, and as always, there is much that we can learn from the life of the church in other parts of the world. Now is a good time to pause and read the story of Peter's escape from prison in Acts chapter 12, if you haven't done so already. Peter had been arrested. Fearing violence, the church was in lockdown, praying day and night. Those gathered at Mary's house heard a knock at the gate. Cautiously, the maid Rhoda went to answer. It was Peter. She ran back into the house. "You're out of your mind," they said to her. "You're seeing things. Peter is in prison, chained between two burly guards." Yet there was Peter, standing on the doorstep, twiddling his thumbs, glancing nervously over his shoulder to make sure he hadn't been followed. There were the disciples in the house. Their earnest prayer had turned into an argument over Rhoda's mental state. This is a comic scene. And by comic, I don't simply mean funny. Comedy observes unexpected, uplifting events and winsome characters who are not overburdened by life's difficulties, but somehow buoyed along through troubling times. Comedy is the delight of the disciples when they discovered that Peter actually was standing there. This head-scratching moment is full of joy and a sense of possibility, an impossible escape from a no-hope situation. Like any good joke, a subsequent retelling ensued. A telling and a telling and a telling. "Tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this," Peter said, and then he left for another place. The story is open-ended. Rather than escaping into hiding, Peter went to tell the others the news. "You have heard about Jesus' resurrection. The life of God, the life that God gives cannot be shut away. I was done for, yet here I am." Like a good joke, the life of Christ cannot be kept to yourself, but it becomes real when it is shared, bubbling over in surprising ways. The life of God is comic, something which we take seriously when we let it transform situations around us. In stark contrast is the fate of the soldiers. Awaking to the empty prison cell, they were filled with dread. King Herod was furious. Peter had escaped on their watch. Herod examined the guards and ordered them to be put to death. Theirs is a tragic fate. In a dislocated and even dangerous world, the good news of Jesus Christ is surprising, shifting our view from resignation to joy. Telling of a king riding a donkey and an empty tomb, Christians give witness to God's radical inversion in Christ, an event that shifts from despair into hope, death into life. Many of the Psalms were written with this joyous sense of inversion. Hear these words from Psalm 146. "He upholds the cause of the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord lifts those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the foreigner and sustains the fatherless and the widow, but he frustrates the ways of the wicked. The early church, steeped in these sorts of songs and psalms, we read about this church in Acts and all the difficulties that they faced. But rather than becoming focused in on itself, the church looked outwards with a comic message for strange and dangerous times. It also remained connected despite its difficulties. Messengers travelled great distances to share letters and news and to spend time with one another. What has struck me about working with our global Churches of Christ family, our partners, is the comic outlook on life that these characters bring to their faith, and that characterises their outlook on life, which they see as full of possibility. These are people who are buoyed along by a comic, winsome hope. Mission has a comic character because it observes life around us and sees the possibility for goodness. This is something that we learn from the global church when we are facing difficulties. So here are a few short comic stories that illustrate this from our wider church family. Varna Baum is an evangelist and director of the Bundaberg Hills Churches of Christ in Bangladesh. And for many living in the hill districts, life is tough and work is hard, and the prospect of a different life is remote. This is the message that Varna takes as he travels to encourage others and to make disciples. He says this: "Why did Jesus choose a donkey? This is a dirty animal. It eats in the dust while all other animals eat good food. It works hard. Why didn't Jesus choose a white horse or an elephant? Because he is humble, and God is humble. Jesus came to ride with us, the dirty people." The good news for Varna is an uplifting story for dirty people. This is comic. In Vietnam, there are over 30 churches that form the Churches of Christ. These churches meet in secret and face a degree of harassment from the police. It is illegal to meet as a church, and yet they still gather in people's homes for an early Sunday morning service. They take bread and juice as communion together in private. But some of these congregations are discovering that they can have an open presence by eating breakfast together after the service in local restaurants. In public, they eat pork rolls and drink bubble tea, their community exuding joy and friendship, a light for all to see. And they are supporting local businesses who are happy to have them. In Zimbabwe, one evangelist from the Associated Churches of Christ told us of losing many church members to a cult. Those who were sick and with limited resources were attracted with promises of miraculous healing. One lady who had been swept up in the fervour returned to her church where no healing had eventuated. She was welcomed back with open arms, and the church scraped together enough money to pay for the operation she desperately needed, curing her. Where some look to false hope, Christians should remain grounded in real life, but see this life transformed by the love of God. From Indonesia, we hear about Christians who carry their light hearts with them into Aceh, a province where professing Christian faith openly is met with corporal punishment. They still attend the local mosque, but they do so secretly as Christians. They call this Gereja Bawang, garlic church, because the mosque looks like a clove of garlic. The church has to get along with others from many different religions and ethnicities, and a comic view of these differences means that they do not become overwhelming. In Java, Christians intermingle with Muslims much more peacefully. From the Churches of Christ Theological College, academic dean Heri Susanto writes, "Christians should be seen as having genuine hearts and always loving people. The love of Christ is what moves us to love our neighbours. Being a Christian is always risky, like being put into a big tornado. Families often reject those who become Christians. Communities can be hostile. There is a paradox between living in the comfort zone as the majority and the willingness to become disciples, exposed to truth in generosity, to live out our faith in the genuine character of Christ. The church must engage with their neighbours with a sense of humour, confident in their identity and witness, which looks outwards in love despite any difficulties this may cause. In a time of dislocation, our purpose as the church hasn't changed: to share the love of Christ with others. Difficulties remind us of the need to be creative in the way we live our lives and the way that we live out this identity. Christian identity is life-giving when it moves outwards beyond itself. We've yet to see just how much of an impact the COVID-19 virus will have in places like Indonesia and Bangladesh, India and parts of Africa. The toll will likely be great. So I encourage you to continue to look beyond ourselves, to look not only to our neighbours but to those overseas. Christians, in the end, are not only those who cry with others, just as Jesus wept. Christians are also those who can laugh, who look on life with comic eyes and see dignity and hope. Those with faith say, even here, God has something to say. Even here, something good might turn our expectations on their heads. The fullness of Christ cannot be contained in temporary isolation, and neither should our life as the church.